In a well-known church community where Pastor Samuel runs a thriving congregation with his wife, Grace. Unbeknownst to her, Samuel had a brief affair with a young woman named Vanessa, a former church member. Vanessa becomes pregnant, but Samuel promises to keep everything a secret and provides her with money to cover her living expenses, including a monthly feeding allowance. He assures her that he will support their child, but that Grace must never find out. As the months pass, Vanessa grows frustrated with the lack of public acknowledgement of their child, feeling isolated and abandoned by Samuel's refusal to take responsibility for his actions. Tensions build as she struggles to make ends meet and feels like a mere secret that Samuel refuses to publicly recognize. Pastor Samuel had always been the pillar of his church, handsome, charismatic, and deeply committed to his faith. He had built a congregation that looked up to him not only as a spiritual leader, but as a man who embodied strength and integrity. His wife, Grace, was equally devoted to their shared mission. Together, they were the epitome of what the congregation aspired to be, a loving, devoted couple who served God and their community selflessly. What the church members didn't know was that Pastor Samuel's life wasn't as spotless as it appeared. Beneath the polished exterior and the well-crafted sermons, Samuel carried a secret that could shatter everything he had built. Vanessa was a former member of the church, a young woman in her late 20s who had come to the congregation seeking solace after a difficult breakup. She quickly became a part of the community, though there was an air of mystery about her. She often sat in the back row, listening intently to Samuel's sermons, and when she did speak, it was with a quiet reverence for the words of the pastor. He took notice of her. It started with a few casual conversations after church, then coffee dates, which Samuel claimed were about helping a troubled soul. Vanessa, however, grew more comfortable around him, seeing in him the attention she had longed for. An older man who seemed to understand her in a way no one else did. The lines blurred. Samuel, too, found comfort in her presence. Her admiration of him feeding his ego and filling a void he didn't even know he had. What was meant to be a temporary connection soon turned into something deeper. The conversations became more intimate, the glances more lingering, and before long, they found themselves in a compromising situation in Samuel's office late one evening after church. Samuel knew it was wrong. His conscience screamed at him, but in the heat of the moment, his better judgment abandoned him. One night turned into many. The affair, a dangerous secret, was born in the shadows of his own church. The guilt weighed on him, but the rush of excitement and the attention from Vanessa made it hard to pull away. In his mind, he told himself that he was helping her, that she needed him, and that the intimacy they shared was a natural extension of their emotional bond. He told himself that Grace would never know, that the perfect image of their marriage would remain intact. But deep down, he knew he was playing with fire. As the affair progressed, Vanessa found herself in a situation she hadn't anticipated. After a few months of secrecy, she discovered she was pregnant. The news struck her like a thunderclap, filling her with equal parts excitement and dread. She didn't want to face the world alone, especially not with a child she could barely afford to care for. And Samuel, she had hoped the pregnancy would bring him closer to her, but instead, it became the catalyst for her deepening frustration. She confronted Samuel with the news in the dead of night, expecting him to make promises to be a father to their child, to acknowledge their connection in the way she had longed for. Instead, Samuel reacted with a mixture of fear and regret. He promised to support her financially, but he would not leave his wife. His church needed him, and he couldn't risk the scandal. Vanessa was devastated. She had hoped for love, for something real, but instead she was left with an empty promise and a growing resentment. Samuel, meanwhile, continued his double life. During the day, he was the devoted pastor, leading his church with confidence, showering Grace with affection. He would hold her hand in church, and they would smile at each other, projecting an image of a perfect, godly marriage. But as soon as the lights dimmed and the doors closed, he was with Vanessa, secretly paying for her apartment, quietly sending money for her living expenses, all the while keeping his wife in the dark. Grace, for all her love and trust in her husband, started to sense something was off. There were small, subtle signs: his late nights at the office, his sudden disinterest in their intimate moments, his tendency to avoid eye contact when she asked certain questions. The morning sun streamed through the stained glass windows of the church, casting vibrant, colorful patterns on the pews as the congregation filled the space. It was a Sunday like any other. Pastor Samuel stood at the pulpit, his deep voice reverberating through the grand hall as he spoke of faith, hope, and the power of God's love. He was a man who knew how to captivate an audience, to inspire and uplift. His sermons were always carefully crafted, drawing from Scripture with authority and making every word sound like it was directly from the heart of God. Grace, his wife, sat in the front row, her head slightly bowed in reverence. She was the embodiment of a faithful pastor's wife, dignified, supportive, and unwavering in her love for Samuel. They had built their life together, side by side, growing their church and their community. Grace was the first to arrive at church each Sunday, making sure everything was in place before the service began. She had always believed in Samuel's vision, in the mission they shared to bring people closer to God. She trusted him, loved him, and never once doubted his devotion to their family or their church. In the pews, the congregation of hundreds sat, eyes fixed on the pulpit, hanging on every word of their beloved pastor. Samuel had earned their trust over the years, preaching with passion, leading with integrity. His family, his ministry, his church, everything seemed so perfect. Theirs was a church built on community, on honesty, on living a righteous life. They all looked up to Samuel and Grace as role models, hoping to live their lives with the same grace and purpose. But behind the facade of faith and devotion, there were cracks, unseen, hidden, but very real. Vanessa was no longer an unfamiliar face to the congregation. Though she had left the church months ago, her presence still lingered in the back of some minds. No one knew the full story of why she had stopped attending, why she had left so suddenly. Some whispers suggested that she had simply fallen away from the faith, that she had lost her way. Others speculated she had moved to another city, but in truth, few people ever questioned it. In a church that celebrated forgiveness and redemption, such matters were often swept under the rug. Pastor Samuel, ever the pillar of the community, had not offered any details. He simply said she was no longer with us and moved on. Yet as the weeks passed, there was an unspoken understanding among a few of the older congregation members that something had happened, something that couldn't be easily explained away. There were murmurs when Samuel would speak of Vanessa in passing, always with the same carefully chosen words, always avoiding any specifics. The whispers, however, never reached Grace's ears. She believed in her husband, and she trusted him completely. To Grace, there was nothing unusual about the way things were. Every Sunday, she stood beside Samuel, smiling at the congregation, watching as the people she had prayed for and loved so dearly filled the church. Her life felt full of purpose, of service. She had no reason to believe anything was amiss. She had no reason to suspect that her perfect husband, the man who had built this church from the ground up, was hiding a secret that would unravel everything. But Vanessa had not disappeared entirely. Though she no longer attended the church, her presence remained a quiet thorn in Samuel's side. Each month when the feeding allowance was delivered, she felt more and more like a pawn in his game of control. Each check she received felt like a slap in the face, a reminder that Samuel had refused to take responsibility for their child in any meaningful way. He had promised her support, but he refused to acknowledge their child publicly, and he refused to take their relationship beyond the shadows. The church, however, remained blissfully unaware of the growing tension behind the scenes. The congregation continued to support Pastor Samuel without question. They continued to donate, to volunteer, to attend church events. His sermons still inspired them to be better, to serve God more faithfully. The family they saw at the pulpit, the one they admired and aspired to emulate, was the picture of perfection. Samuel's authority seemed unquestionable. Grace stood by his side, a quiet symbol of unwavering loyalty, never once doubting the foundation they had built together. In the quiet corners of the church, a few people noticed that things seemed off. A woman from the choir, who had once been close to Vanessa, would often glance at Samuel with a strange look in her eyes. A member of the youth group, who had once heard rumors of the affair, would catch the pastor's eye with a certain wariness. But these were passing moments. The congregation, as a whole, had a deep faith in Samuel, and that faith clouded their judgment. To them, the pastor could do no wrong. Vanessa's anger had grown to a point where it consumed her every thought. Each passing day felt like a countdown, a slow march toward an inevitable confrontation with Samuel. The support checks he had been sending her were always just enough to keep her from falling apart, but never enough to make her feel like an equal partner in the life they had created. The money came with no affection, no acknowledgement, no promise of a future together. It was as if Samuel saw her as a problem to be solved, something to manage, not someone to love. The pregnancy was advancing, and with it, her bitterness. Vanessa's resentment simmered under the surface, building into a boiling rage. She had tried to be patient, to give Samuel time to come around, but each time she called him, each time she met him in private, he promised nothing but empty words. No future, no real commitment, only the cold comfort of financial support. Vanessa had always been a strong woman. She had a history of resilience, of fighting through tough circumstances. But this was different. This felt like betrayal, not just from Samuel, but from the entire world. She had invested so much in him, trusted him, believed in the promises he made, and now she was left with nothing but a child that he refused to publicly acknowledge. Every time she saw him in church, standing tall, preaching to his congregation, she couldn't help but feel the sting of rejection. He was so good at playing the part. The perfect husband, the perfect pastor, the perfect father to everyone but her child. The breaking point came one afternoon when Vanessa, finally fed up with the charade, demanded to meet Samuel. He had been avoiding her calls for days, telling her he was too busy with church matters. But Vanessa wasn't having it anymore. This time she had to be heard. She needed him to understand the gravity of what he was doing and what he was failing to do. She stood in front of his office, pacing, her heart racing, her fists clenched. She had planned what she would say for days, but now that she was standing there, the words felt inadequate. Samuel finally walked in, looking startled, as if he hadn't expected her to come by at all. His face, usually so calm and controlled, was now marked by the familiar tension she had come to expect from their meetings. He was the pastor, the man with the answers, the one who held the power to fix things. But this time, he wasn't going to get away with pretending everything was fine. "What do you want now, Vanessa?" he asked, his voice tight with irritation. "I told you, I'm doing everything I can." Vanessa's eyes burned with fury as she took a step toward him. "Everything you can?" she spat, her voice rising. "Is this everything you can do? Sending me a few $100s and expecting me to just disappear into the background? I'm not just some problem for you to manage, Samuel. I'm carrying your child. And yet, you act like we don't exist." Samuel shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. He hated this confrontation, hated how it made him feel exposed. He had convinced himself that he could keep his life compartmentalized, his family life on one side, his affair with Vanessa on the other. But now that illusion was starting to crack. "I'm doing this for you, for your sake," Samuel said defensively. "You don't need anyone to know about this. It would destroy everything. My reputation, my marriage, my ministry." Vanessa's face twisted with disgust. "Destroy everything?" she repeated, her voice low and seething. "You're not worried about destroying anything. You're worried about losing control. You don't care about me or about our child. You care about your image, your perfect life, and how it all looks to everyone else." She took another step forward, her face inches from his. "But I'm not going to stay quiet anymore, Samuel. You don't get to play the saint while I rot in silence. I'm done with this." Her words cut through him, sharper than he anticipated. For the first time, Samuel was truly faced with the consequences of his actions. He had always been able to brush off her complaints, ignore her demands. But now the enormity of her pain and frustration hit him like a wave. "Vanessa, please," he said, his voice more pleading now. "Let's not do this. I'll give you more money. No," she interrupted, shaking her head. "I don't need your money anymore. I need you to be a man. I need you to stand by me. I need you to acknowledge our child, to tell your wife the truth. I'm not going to keep hiding for you." There was a long, pregnant pause as the weight of her words hung in the air. Samuel looked down at the floor, unable to meet her gaze. In that moment, he realized how much he had underestimated her, how much he had believed he could control her, manipulate her into accepting whatever scraps he was willing to give. But Vanessa wasn't that woman. Not anymore. His silence spoke volumes. He wasn't going to change. The church was buzzing with activity as the evening service approached. The worship team rehearsed their hymns, the ushers prepared the bulletins, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the back halls. For most of the congregation, it was just another Sunday evening service. But for Samuel, the evening was more than just another opportunity to preach. It was the culmination of everything he had tried to keep hidden. The tension from his encounter with Vanessa that afternoon hung over him like a dark cloud. His office felt suffocating as he sat alone, staring at the sermon notes he had meticulously prepared earlier in the week. The words on the paper blurred in front of his eyes. His mind wasn't on the message of faith, hope, or grace he was supposed to impart to his congregation. Instead, he could only think of Vanessa and the fury in her eyes. Her words echoed in his head, and his stomach churned with guilt and dread. For years, Samuel had built a life based on control, his family, his ministry, his reputation. He had always thought he could manage it all, keep everything in neat little boxes. But the truth had started to seep through the cracks. Vanessa wasn't going to stay silent. She had made that clear. And now, as the evening drew closer, Samuel found himself facing a choice he never thought he would have to make. He could confess everything to Grace. He could tell her about the affair, about Vanessa, about the child. It would tear their world apart. Grace would never look at him the same way again. And the church, his livelihood, his identity, would be destroyed. He knew Grace. She was a woman of deep faith. But this would break her heart beyond repair. And once the truth came out, there would be no turning back. The congregation, the people who adored him, would see him for who he truly was, a man of sin, a man who had failed them. But there was another option. He could keep his secrets, silence Vanessa, and continue to protect the life he had worked so hard to build. He could pay her off, keep her at arm's length, and hope that she would eventually move on. It wasn't the honorable choice, but it was the safer one. The problem was Vanessa wasn't backing down. She had made it clear that she was done being controlled. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Grace standing in the doorway, her warm smile a stark contrast to the storm raging inside him. "Samuel, are you ready?" "It's almost time for the service," she said, her voice calm and steady, as it always was. Samuel blinked and forced a smile, but it felt hollow. He stood up quickly and adjusted his tie, trying to look the part of the perfect pastor. "Yes, Grace. Just a minute." She stepped inside, her presence a comfort, yet a reminder of everything he stood to lose. "I know you've been stressed lately," she said, her eyes scanning his face, "but you're going to do great tonight. You always do." Samuel nodded, but his mind was far from the sermon he had prepared. He was torn. His body felt heavy with the weight of his choices. Grace was the last person who deserved to be hurt by this. She had supported him through thick and thin, stood by his side through every challenge. She was a good woman, a faithful wife. But in his heart, Samuel knew the truth. He was no longer the man she thought he was. "I'm just a little tired," he said, forcing his voice to sound light. "I'll be fine. You go ahead and get ready. I'll be there in a minute." Grace didn't seem convinced, but she kissed him on the cheek and left the room, trusting him to find his way. She had no idea how close they were to the edge of disaster. As soon as she was gone, Samuel sank back into his chair. The quiet of the room settled over him like a shroud, amplifying the chaos in his mind. He could still feel the sting of Vanessa's words. She wasn't going to stop until she got what she wanted, until she forced him to choose. He had lived his life managing everyone, controlling every aspect of his world. But now, for the first time, he was powerless. He had two choices, and neither one was easy. The first choice, telling Grace the truth, felt like a betrayal of everything he had worked for. He had built a life with Grace, a family, a ministry. To confess everything would mean abandoning all of it. The church would fall apart. The trust of the congregation would be shattered. His reputation as a man of God would be forever tarnished. His marriage, his life as he knew it, would be over. But was that a price he was willing to pay for honesty? For redemption? The second choice, silencing Vanessa, was equally dangerous. It meant continuing to lie, continuing to hide behind a mask of righteousness while living a double life. It meant ignoring the pain and suffering of the woman he had betrayed, pretending to be something he was not. But it also meant preserving his reputation, his ministry, his marriage. The evening service had begun like any other. The congregation stood, their voices lifted in unison, filling the church with a familiar, almost sacred harmony. Samuel stood at the pulpit, watching the sea of faces below him, all of them expecting a message of hope, of faith, of peace. But as his eyes scanned the congregation, something felt off. A chill lingered in the air, a tension that wasn't there before. He couldn't shake the feeling that tonight would be different. Grace sat in the front row, her usual calm demeanor radiating from her. She looked beautiful, her face lit by the soft glow of the candles surrounding the altar, her hands folded in prayer. Samuel watched her for a moment, a pang of guilt hitting him in the chest. She deserved so much better than this, but the weight of his choices had long since outgrown his ability to fix them. As the worship team sang, Samuel prepared to step into his role, pushing aside the gnawing unease. He opened his Bible, but his mind was elsewhere. He could feel it. Vanessa was somewhere in the background, her presence like a shadow in the corner of his mind. He couldn't help but wonder if she was watching him, waiting for her moment to strike. When it came time for his sermon, Samuel took a deep breath and stepped to the center of the stage. His voice, though trembling slightly, carried the familiar cadence of a seasoned preacher. He spoke of faith, of God's grace, of redemption. His words flowed easily, the ones he had practiced 1,000 times before. But as he spoke, his eyes flickered to the back of the room, and his heart skipped a beat. There, standing at the back of the church, was Vanessa. She wasn't alone. A few heads turned as she made her way down the aisle, her presence impossible to ignore. The rustling of whispers rippled through the congregation, a low murmur of confusion. She was dressed in black, her eyes locked onto Samuel's with a determined, almost defiant gaze. She was no longer hiding in the shadows. She wasn't going to let him get away with this anymore. Samuel's words faltered for a split second, but he quickly regained his composure, trying to mask his surprise. He continued speaking, but his focus was no longer on his sermon. His heart raced, his palms began to sweat. His mind was reeling. What was Vanessa doing here? How had she gotten in? Grace, who had noticed the sudden shift in Samuel's behavior, turned around to see what had caught his attention. Her eyes widened when she saw Vanessa standing there, and a look of confusion spread across her face. She knew something was wrong, but she couldn't quite place it. Vanessa reached the front of the church, and Samuel's worst fear began to materialize. The silence in the room grew heavier, and all eyes were on her now. Her steps were measured, deliberate, as though she knew the weight of the moment. She stood a few feet from the altar, not looking at anyone else but Samuel. The room was still except for the faint hum of the overhead lights. Grace stood up, her expression shifting from confusion to concern. "Samuel, what is she doing here?" Her voice was soft, almost pleading, but there was an edge to it now, a sense of growing anxiety. Samuel could feel his chest tighten, his throat dry as he glanced at Vanessa again. She was unwavering, her gaze fixed on him. There was no turning back now. "Vanessa," Samuel began, his voice laced with tension. "This is not the time. Please leave." But Vanessa didn't move. Instead, she spoke, her voice calm, but filled with an underlying fury that made the room feel colder. "No, Samuel, you leave," she said, her eyes burning with a mix of anger and desperation. "You don't get to hide anymore. You don't get to live this lie while I'm left in the dark." The words hung in the air like a sharp slap. The congregation shifted uncomfortably, whispers beginning to ripple through the room. But Samuel's heart pounded too loudly for him to hear much of anything else. Grace looked between Samuel and Vanessa, her face paling as the truth began to dawn on her. She had known something wasn't right, but this was something she hadn't anticipated. "Vanessa?" Samuel tried again, his voice softer now but laced with panic. "This is not the place for this. Please, we can talk about this. No, Vanessa interrupted, stepping closer to him. You don't get to decide when or where we talk. You've kept me quiet long enough. You've kept me and our child hidden from the world. You've played this perfect, righteous man for far too long. She paused, her chest rising and falling as her breath quickened. I won't be quiet anymore. You'll face the truth, and so will she. At that, her eyes flickered toward Grace. The weight of the accusation landed on the entire congregation like a storm, the air thick with anticipation. Grace's face turned a shade of pale white as she stood frozen in disbelief. Grace is left grappling with the truth of her husband's infidelity in the brutal way in which it all came to an end. Vanessa is arrested, and the police begin to investigate the events leading up to the shooting. As the story spreads through the community, people begin to question how such a tragedy could have happened. Some sympathize with Vanessa's pain, while others condemn her actions as unforgivable. The church is torn apart, with members leaving in droves as the once thriving congregation falls into disarray. Grace struggles to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the man who betrayed her. She finds herself torn between grief for her husband's death and betrayal by the man she loved. The church, once a beacon of faith and hope, is now embroiled in scandal.